All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to talk about postcards from the borderlands with author David Mould.
You have
Please,
the book. That's wonderful.
I do have the book. um, please post your questions about our discussion in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the program. David Mould is Professor Emeritus of Media Arts and Studies at Ohio University and has traveled widely in Asia and Southern Africa. Born in the UK, he worked as a newspaper and TV journalist before moving to the US. His travel essays and articles have been published in Newsweek, Christian Science Monitor, Times Higher Education, and History News Network. In addition to the book we're discussing today, he has also written Monsoon Postcards, Indian Ocean Journeys, and Postcards from Stanland, Journeys in Central Asia. So welcome. We're so glad to have you. You want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and the book, and then while you do your presentation, I'm going to turn off my camera, and I'll come back at the end and we'll do questions.
Okay, well, I think I'll just jump into the presentation. So, Jennifer, thank you so much, and thanks to the Fort Worth Public Library for hosting this presentation. And if there's one thing I'd like people to come away with tonight, one takeaway, it's the next time that you cross a border, when we can all travel again, or even open a book or an atlas and look at a map, think about how that border came to be, because there's usually an interesting story, sometimes a messy story, sometimes there's conflict, but there are really very few natural borders in the world. Now, I've been fascinated by borders since childhood. As Jennifer mentioned, I grew up in the UK, and as a child, I was lucky enough that my parents took me on, my sister and myself, on vacations, camping vacations to France and Spain and Italy. And it was always really exciting to cross the border post, the border officers in their uniforms examining our passports. I mean, there were never any issues, but just the thrill of crossing a national border, was, for me, actually the highlight of the vacation. Since that time, as I've gone on to a journalistic career and later an academic career, I've come to think more broadly about borders. Are they simply walls and fences and border posts, or are the borders within countries, physical, economic, social, or racial? And then, and this is kind of where we'll start tonight, are the borders within our minds? This is the title of the presentation, the way we think about unfamiliar places. So this presentation is loosely based on the final chapter of my latest book, Postcards from the Borderlands, where I try to pull together some of these thoughts about borders. Now, I've been very lucky in the past 25 years to have traveled very widely, a little bit as a tourist, but mostly it's been for work. I've worked primarily for international organizations, most recently UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and as a trainer, researcher, consultant, and in the process I've crossed a lot of borders. And as I travel, as people pay me to travel and work, I write. And as Jennifer mentioned, I have 3 books out now. The latest, Borderlands, came out last November. I have one on the Indian Ocean region, Monsoon Postcards, and then one on Central Asia, which is a region I worked in from the mid-1990s. We'll talk a bit about it tonight, to about 2012, 2013. So we're going to be traveling tonight to Africa, Central Asia, and South Asia, but we're going to start on more familiar ground in the United States. And I guess because I'm in Texas tonight, it's okay to make fun of New Yorkers. So this is a classic, I'll call it a map, but it's really a piece of artwork by a man called Daniel Wallingford, an artist, and he published this in 1932, and he sold these by mail order. And it pokes fun at, New Yorkers, shall we say, exaggerated perception of the size and importance of New York. So Brooklyn's larger than most states. Manhattan's pretty big too. As you move west here, let's see. I guess Texas is figuring somewhere there, though it looks a little wonky. As you move further west, the states all get mixed up. So this is a lot of fun. But in a sense, it represents something that's been researched quite a lot, which is that we often perceive our own states or cities or communities as larger and more important than they are in relation to other places. And so this has kind of been perpetuated. This is a New Yorker front page from '76, and as you can see, a few city blocks here are the center of the universe, and the rest of the United States, I don't think. Oh yes, Texas is there, sort of vaguely. The rest of the United States is compressed into one or two city blocks. The rest of the world is just out there. So this is fun, but I think it sort of again indicates the kind of maps that we have in our own mind in terms of how we perceive the regions, the cities in which we live or familiar with, and how we perceive more distant places. So I'm going to take a couple of the other examples here of how the United States has been, or the borders of the United States have been perceived. And this is actually a map that a portion of a map that I actually have framed at my home in Charleston, West Virginia. And this is part of a Soviet era middle and high school map. Excuse me. And I've just taken the northeastern United States here, an area from, we've got West Virginia, Washington, D.C., up to New York and New England. It's obviously a much larger map. And I bought this at a bookstore in Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, in 1996, just because it looked interesting, and it was cheap. And of course, at the airport, the customs officials wanted to confiscate it, claiming it was an important historical artifact. I was able to point out that maps like this had hung on schoolroom walls throughout the Soviet Union for years. It was neither rare nor particularly historical. It was just interesting. Now, at the time, I didn't know much Russian, but as my Russian improved, I started to look at the map in more detail. And basically, it's an economic and demographic map of the United States from the period from after the Civil War through to about the end of World War I. And the legend on the right, those black marks show mineral deposits. The square is Ugol, coal, the kind of the large triangle is neft, oil, and the smaller triangle, Zhelezny Rudy, which would be iron ore deposits. So there are plenty of those there. But the thing that really fascinated me about this map were those red flags that were all over the country, but kind of concentrated in the northeast and the Midwest. What were these? They were by far the most prominent symbols on the map, more prominent than places, the things that marked cities or any other detail there. And the clue to me were the dates underneath. These marked the dates of labor unrest, strikes, and other, other labor, labor activities in the United States. So we had the Great Railroad Strike at the end of the 19th century. We had the Homestead Strike in Pittsburgh. Further out west, we had the Colorado miners' strike in 1913. And the Russian translation in the legend is Рабочее движение, working movements, literally. So this is very interesting to me because it showed how the United States was mapped to Soviet school children. I mean, there are state borders on there, but the most prominent symbols are these red flags, which indicate that the real borders in the United States were not state borders or physical borders. They were class borders between the proletariat ready to rise against those capitalist bosses supported by the government. So, the way in which places are mapped and the most prominent symbols, I think, indicate, in this case, borders within, at least as presented within the Soviet view. Now, you might think this view had sort of disappeared when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So let me share with you my favorite English language version of a widely circulated map from Russia, which indicates how the United States is going to break up, okay? And this may be a surprise to you that the United States is going to break up, but this was a prediction by a Russian academic and a foreign policy wonk, a guy called Igor Panarin, who said that just as the Soviet Union had broken up, so the United States would fall apart, a result of economic collapse, mass immigration, moral degradation. And this is how it would go. He kind of did it by states. So, yes, Texas is going back to Mexico. All right, well, there's some historical justification for that, I suppose. And where I live in West Virginia, we're going to go join the European Union, which is good news because my former country, Britain, just left it. Now, I mean, this looks silly, but when I was traveling in Central Asia, former Soviet republics, in 2004, 2005, people would come up to me and they'd say, when is the United States going to fall apart? I said, that's ridiculous, that's silly. And they would point me to the Russian version of this map and the articles that went with it to indicate that this had been predicted. And I think you can see how attractive that might be to people who had lived for 75 years in the Soviet Union to realize or to think that their arch enemy, the evil empire of the United States, was going to fall apart in the same way. Panarin actually put the odds of disintegration at between 45 and 55%, the likelihood, but usually that caveat, that qualification was ignored in the reporting. So this looks silly, but is it really any sillier than some of the views that we might have of, for example, Africa? A very nice cartoon on the left from the Philadelphia Inquirer, pointing, kind of poking fun at some of our stereotypes here. The map on the right is particularly interesting as well, because this is one of a series of maps that analyzes the most common adjective that Google will autocomplete if you type in the question, why is such and such a country so? Why is Nigeria so? Why is South Africa so? Why is Kenya so? Why is Egypt so? And so we've got a lot of poors here, a few riches, a few hots, a few dangers. But again, points to the way in which we kind of form impressions of places. So, I guess my takeaway from this is that we all construct these kind of mental maps based on, our values, our background, our culture, our knowledge. But in some ways, the real borders, the real political borders of the world make no more sense than some of these maps in our minds. I was an undergraduate history major in Britain, and I was studying the period from the 16th to the 19th century in Europe. And that was a time of lots of wars and conflicts and treaties, and every countries were constantly grabbing bits of territory from other countries. Very confusing. The maps kept changing, a lot to keep up with. But when I opened the atlas and I looked at other parts of the world, particularly the Middle East and Africa, Asia as well, I started asking the question, why are some countries really strangely shaped? Why did they end up that way? And why are there straight line borders? So the answer in the case of Africa and other places as well is that these borders are not natural at all. They were decided in the case of Africa by political leaders, colonial leaders, sitting around conference tables in European capitals, dividing up places that they had never visited before into spheres of influence. So in this case, the major colonial powers carved up Africa and drew those lines without any regard to topography, where mountains or rivers were, without any regard to where ethnic groups lived, without any regard to religion. They were arbitrarily drawn. And that's well illustrated by a quote from this guy, the British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury. And, he's sitting at a conference table in London with his French counterparts, and they're trying to figure out where the border between the British colony of Nigeria and the French colony of Niger is going to go. And as he said, we're just drawing these lines upon the map. We have no idea where they actually go. So the arbitrary division of land, by the colonial powers. Now, there's a principle here in international law. I'm going to mangle the Latin, uti possidetis iuris, as you possess under the law. And the principle here is that it's simpler and easier when a colony gains independence or colonies become independent to simply retain the borders that they were drawn by the colonial power. So this originated in South America in the 19th century when the Spanish Empire was being dissolved. And to avoid border disputes, it was simpler and easier to say, okay, one colony, you become Argentina, or another is Venezuela, another is Colombia, and so on, retaining those colonial borders, even if those colonial borders were imposed on a region which really had no unity itself. The alternative is a messier one, self-determination, where people or their leaders, upon independence from a colonial power, decide to divide up the territory into smaller portions, usually based on ethnicity or religion. So here's what happened in Africa, or rather what didn't happen in Africa. Look at the map on the left. This is colonial Africa with the British, the French, the Belgians, and the Portuguese, and so on. Some Germans is there. And on the right, this is a modern map, but this is basically the map from like the 60s onwards when these countries became independent. A few changes. South Sudan has emerged and it wasn't there before. But as you see, the boundaries, the borders have not changed, okay? In most cases, all of these countries have maintained their colonial era borders. And that's been a source of conflict and problems because most countries in Africa have multiple ethnic groups, multiple languages, and they were cobbled together by a colonial power. And so maintaining a sense of national unity is always a challenge. And this is why Africa has been riven by conflicts between ethnic groups. Most recently in Ethiopia, because these are artificial borders. Could it have been different? This is a very interesting map. This is actually what we call a counterfactual because this did not happen. But this is a map by a Swedish artist, a guy called Nikolaj Sion. And he did a study of the African continent in 1844, just before the colonial powers started coming in and carving it all up. And he was looking at traditional kingdoms where ethnic groups lived. And I don't think you're going to find a straight line anywhere on this map. And in traditional Islamic cartography, the south is north and the north is south. But kind of interesting to speculate on what Africa might have looked like if the colonial powers had not come in. I'm going to argue that the same thing, or pretty much the same thing, happened when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. That those colonial era boundaries, and the Soviets didn't like to be called imperialists, but they were to a large extent retained. So just to be brief in the history here, the Soviet Union inherited the territory of Imperial Russia. From the period from about 1870 onwards, the armies of the Tsar, the imperial armies advanced eastwards into Siberia and southeast into the region where I've worked a lot, Central Asia, represented here by the Kazakh, Uzbek, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, Tajik, SSRs, or Soviet Socialist Republics. So in 1917, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets inherited all of this, and there was a civil war that followed, but, by the end of the 1920s, they'd consolidated, the Russian Empire together. Now, the Soviets were really worried about two things in Central Asia. They were worried about Islam, because most people were at least nominally Muslims. They were also worried about ethnic groups getting together and, combating their control. In Central Asia, before the Soviets came in, there were really not many borders. There were a few little city-states, but, a lot of the people were herders. They were moving their herds from summer to winter pastures. There were no straight borders as such. And, the divisions were defined by people's family, their clan, and their tribe, and some conglomerations of tribes. So the notion of borders really didn't exist. So this was not good enough for the Soviets. They wanted to impose borders so that they could control ethnic groups, to make sure that no ethnic group had a majority, a population majority in any particular area. And for example here, the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz ethnically are very close. The languages are very close together. I've worked extensively in both Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And they were traditionally herders. They were moving their herds of horses and sheep from summer to winter pastures. So, the way I tell it, and it probably is not too far from the truth, is that some Soviet cartographer in the 1920s stands in a river valley and he points to a shepherd on one hill and he says, "You're a Kazakh," and he points to a shepherd on another hill and said, "You're a Kyrgyz, and we're going to draw the border line down this river valley." Thus we have a border. Now, for all intents and purposes, for the life of the Soviet Union, this did not make much difference in the ordinary daily lives of people. Okay, if you lived in the Kazakh SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic, you could cross into the Uzbek SSR to go to the market, or to go to school, or to visit your relatives, or you could go on vacation in the Kyrgyz SSR. Okay, it was a little about as complicated as crossing from Texas to Oklahoma. Okay, there'd be some border sign there, but really no barrier to travel. But what happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed is that suddenly these internal borders became national borders, and there were border guards, and you couldn't go across to the market, and you couldn't visit your relatives, and the farmer who had land on both sides couldn't get to his wells. So, these internal borders were imposed that, didn't mean really anything during the life of the Soviet Union, suddenly became national borders, and suddenly there were problems. This is a region of Kyrgyzstan and eastern Uzbekistan called the Fergana Valley. Actually, it's an area where I kind of started working, 1995, 1996. And the kind of the green-yellow is Uzbekistan, and the white is mostly Kyrgyzstan, some Tajikistan. I mean, look at the way that the border zigs and zags in and out, up and around and round about. I mean, this is not accidental. This is the way the Soviet cartographers drew the borders so that they could kind of keep control of the ethnic groups there. Look on the right of the map. There are two cities in Kyrgyzstan, Osh and Jalalabad, respectively the second and third largest cities in the country. Osh is about 300,000, Jalalabad about 150,000. They're on opposite sides of the valley here. And as you would expect, with the second and third largest cities, there should be a lot of commerce between them. But look at the way the road goes. In order to get from one to the other, you've got to go through part of Uzbekistan. And that's the problem, because since the 1990s, there have been periodic conflicts between ethnic groups and between the countries as well. Kyrgyzstan has a lot of water in its mountains that Uzbekistan needs for its cotton fields. Uzbekistan has natural gas that Kyrgyzstan needs. And in Soviet times, I mean, there was central control, and, water was released and gas was piped. But when these became independent countries, suddenly there are wars over natural resources. But from a practical purpose, if you're a trader and you want to travel from Osh to Jalalabad or vice versa, you're going to hit that border in Uzbekistan, and the border's either going to be closed or the Uzbek border guards are going to hit you up for fines and transit visas or whatever. There will be hassles or there'll be long delays. So it's actually quicker to take this long way around through this little place called Uzgen. It's about 65 miles, takes about 3 times as long because it's a kind of mountainous route. But that's the practical the practical legacy of these artificial borders that were drawn between the Soviet socialist republics by the Soviets, then preserved today in national borders. Okay, I always have to end anything I say about Central Asia with my favorite New Yorker cover page. This is the New Yorkistan cover page, which makes fun of our ignorance of this part of the world by taking Arabic and Persian and even a few Yiddish names and sort of transforming them. So we get the flat Pushtuns, and I love hip hopperbad as well. And I've kept my kind of critique of the ignorance of public officials deliberately bipartisan here. But I kind of was surprised, and maybe I wasn't surprised. I was a little taken aback when I'd come back to my university. I was amongst academic colleagues, and people would say, "Where have you been?" I said, "I've been to Kyrgyzstan." They say, "Kurdistan?" I said, No, that's in Iraq and Syria and Turkey, and it's not a country, at least not yet. I've been to Kyrgyzstan. I said, south of Russia, and do you know where Kazakhstan is? Eventually they'd throw up their hands. They said, "Oh, too many stands. You've just been in Stanland," which is actually total nonsense because the word stan in Persian means land. So literally I'd been in Landland or Lala Land, should we say. Okay, we're going to move to what I consider to be the most tragic border story of all. And this is a story of borders which were not drawn on that principle of colonial borders, preserving colonial borders, but where a single principle of self-determination, religion, was used. The partition of British India in 1947. So again, to compress the history here, British India, the most populous and richest colony in the British Empire, was formed over the period of about 150 years by the East India Company, which began as a trading organization but swiftly developed into a rather formidable military power. So if you were a Maharaja in 19th century India and you wanted to grab some territory from your neighboring Maharaja, you called in the mercenaries of the East India Company to do your dirty work for you. And you paid them, and then suddenly, you found yourself, you were under British protection, as they called it, which meant that the British had control over your foreign policy and your defence forces, and you were now essentially a client of the British Empire. So when by the 1930s, it became very clear that Britain could no longer hold on to its most populous and richest colony, and that independence would come. The Indian independence movement with Mahatma Gandhi, Jinnah and others was gaining strength. And especially after World War II, it became fairly urgent to come up with some way to divide up British India. So the map on the right shows, the yellow shows the provinces of British India, the areas that were under direct British control. The pink parts are the princely states where traditional rulers still had at least authority over internal affairs. So the question here became, how are we going to divide up this this subcontinent? I've circled Hyderabad here, and unfortunately in the map on the left the colours are reversed. So the princely states are yellow and the British provinces are pink. But I spent some time in Hyderabad and looked at the history here. The ruler of Hyderabad, the Nizam of Hyderabad, said Hyderabad should become a constitutional monarchy within the British Commonwealth. We're a viable country. Hyderabad in 1947 was as large in land area as Britain itself. It had a population of 16 million and an economy the size of Belgium's. It would have been a viable country, in that respect. And there are many countries in the world that are smaller and less populous than Hyderabad. The problem here was that if you use that principle, taking these internal borders, colonial borders of the princely states and the provinces and creating countries, Hyderabad was one of the larger princely states. There were 565 princely states in India. So if you'd followed that principle, you would have created almost 600 new countries within the Indian subcontinent, which is certainly a political, economic, and certainly a cartographic train wreck waiting to happen. So one by one, the princely states opted to join either India or Pakistan based on the majority religion of the population. The problem came in three provinces with a mixed population. Let me talk about Bengal first. Bengal in the east was a large British province, religiously mixed, Hindus and Muslims. And the British had tried to partition Bengal in 1905 into a mostly Muslim East Bengal and a mostly Hindu West Bengal, and the Bengalis would have none of it. They said, look, we are more united by culture and language and economy than we're divided by religion. I mean, this is a region where there was a great Bengal Renaissance in the 19th century, a great literary and artistic flowering that produced a Nobel Literature Prize winner. And so the British, in fact, abandoned the project a few years later. But when we get to 1947 and they start drawing the borders between what is now India and East Pakistan become pretty close to what was set in 1905. The principle of religion. This is the guy who was given the task of drawing the border in Bengal and also in two other provinces, Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir, which had, roughly the same numbers of Hindus and Muslims. And he was given a short timeline, inadequate resources to do it. And when the border was announced in August 1947, in places it ran through the middle of villages, sometimes the middle of houses, and lots of people found themselves in the wrong country and tried to move. We will never know the extent of the genocide that occurred as the communal violence that still exists today as Hindus and Muslims tried to move to what they perceived to be, the country where they should be. A terrible error using religion to draw the borders. And here's what resulted. We have this strangely bifurcated country, Pakistan, separated by 1,400 miles of India. What could possibly go wrong? West Pakistan, which had about the same population as East Pakistan, dominated the country politically and militarily, taxed the East, but the real deal breaker here, if I could put it this way, was language. West Pakistan attempted to impose the Urdu language on East Pakistan. Nobody spoke Urdu in East Pakistan. It was a language of the Quran, and so it had to be used. And from the 1950s, there was a simmering resistance movement. Language became a kind of a symbol for a wider resistance movement, which eventually broke out in 1971 with a 9-month liberation war, which led to the independence of Bangladesh. And, to me, it shows the absolute folly of using religion as a principle to draw borders. And I've spent a lot of time in Bangladesh working for UNICEF over the last 3 or 4 years and find it to be a fascinating country. But look at the border here. I mean, again, this is a product of the lines drawn in 1947. This is the East Pakistan border. It zigs in and out, turns back on itself in length, about half the length of the US-Canada border. And it's a small country, size of Illinois or Iowa, crowded country, about 170 million people living there. But again, a very, very strange, a very artificial border. Okay, I'm going to finish here by confessing to my cartographic crimes, and if anybody who's with us tonight participating feels it's their civic duty to report me to the appropriate authorities in India, I suppose that is your right. So I have violated a section of the 1961 Criminal Law Amendment Act and also customs declarations by using, importing, and even republishing what India would consider to be incorrect maps of the country. Look at the map on the right in the northern part where near Tajikistan. That is the province of Jammu and Kashmir, one of those 3 provinces, Bengal and Punjab were the 2 others, that were divided up in 1947 between India and Pakistan. Now on this map, an official India map, it's all part of India. It's all this sort of orange color, except that it's not. Okay, this is the more accurate map. It was divided between the 2 countries. India has more than Pakistan, but there's a heavily militarized line of control there. The 2 countries have fought 3 wars over Kashmir, and but India claims the whole country, and its official maps will show all of Jammu and Kashmir as being part of India. And then we get to Google. And Google Maps, which, kind of have an outsized influence on people's view of the world. Google, as a commercial company, wants to do business all over the world, And so it, shall we say, bows to local political sensibilities. So if you're sitting in India and you're looking at a map of Jammu and Kashmir online, you're going to see the map on the right, which shows all of the province as being part of India. However, if you're across the border in Pakistan, you're getting a much more realistic Google map, which actually shows this border, the line of control, showing the real border there. So I guess my takeaway from this is that every country, or at least its leaders and many of its citizens as well, you know, perceive the borders of their country to be, different from the way that they actually are, usually an expanded area. And so, I mean, I kind of asked myself the question, uh, you know, is India's view of Jammu and Kashmir, its expanded borders there, really any different from the way in which those New Yorkers in Down in Wallingford or the New Yorker cover page perceive the size of New York? These are all mental maps, all parts of perception. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I do weekly travel blogs to an email list, and so if you would like to get on the list, just pop me an email, davidhmould@gmail.com. But I'd be really happy to entertain questions now. And again, my thanks to Jennifer for hosting this tonight. Okay, and I think I'll stop share there. Okay.
All right. So I'm going to get us started on questions.
Oh yeah, you get the privilege of the first question, don't you? Yeah.
So,
Librarian's privilege. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about land borders, but I know that sea borders are also very tricky. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah. I mean, have you seen any border posts at sea recently? No, it's a little difficult to put them in the ocean. No, I mean, no, I'm being a little facetious here. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the next conflicts are going to be fought over, maybe fought over sea borders. Every country which has a coastline in principle has what's called a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, okay, which it used to be important for fishing. You had fishing rights there, but today is much more important in terms of what's at the bottom of the ocean, mineral rights. And so this is going to bring countries into conflict. So we've seen China building all of those islands in the South China Sea, and if you've got an island there, you can claim 200 miles around it. Of course, that 200 miles may overlap with somebody else's 200 miles. So you're going to have conflict there, and you're going to have, your Navy, taking fishing boats and other things like that. So that's going to be a big potential for conflict. The area, and I mean, I talk about it actually in my other book, Monsoon Postcards. The Indian Ocean area is very interesting. Jennifer, can you guess which country in the world has the largest exclusive economic zone in terms of, sea area, 200 miles around it? Make a wild guess. Or don't.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking it could maybe Russia or China, or possibly India. Kind of.
Yeah.
They are large.
Yeah. I mean, Russia would have a lot. It's got all of that Arctic area. Now, interesting enough, it's France, and I mean, now it's not about the French coast at all. But France held on to all of these little bits of territory all over the world. For instance, there's a little place off Madagascar, a little island called Mayotte. Okay, it's a very small island, but they got 200 miles around it, and if they discover oil, as I think they've done in the Madagascar Channel, then France has the right to that. So it's quite interesting, and it's kind of one of those underreported stories, Yeah.
So, and that's really interesting. It makes me think about Cuba. the U.S. and Cuba being so close together, and all
Yeah,
of the stuff that happened in the 60s.
yeah,
And then also the Middle East. I know we send our ships through some very narrow channel areas that is in some cases disputed water territory.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, we won't move away from disputed land, but I mean, disputed sea is going to become much more important, I think. And yeah, I mean, and you look then also at choke points around the world. So I mean, you're referring, amongst other things, to the Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf. It's like, but I mean, historically, control over these kind of choke points, these narrow shipping lanes, has been really, really important in terms of military power. Yeah.
Um, so I think your kind of your I really thought it was funny in the book and in the presentation you're talking about people's maps and what those maps look like, and it made me think of that uh I don't know if it was 40s or 50s musical The King and I, where she goes to teach the kids,
Oh yeah.
have the map, and Siam is this big.
Oh yeah. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, the King and I. Yeah.
And she puts up the British map, and Siam is this big. And the kids are all like, no, no. So I really think that's interesting kind of perception, right? So it's an
It's like the New Yorkers' perception. Yeah.
yeah, they're kind of arbitrary, and thinking about borders too, they're kind of arbitrary markers. But to some groups, it's very important exactly where that marker is. And for other groups, it's like, it could be this much or that much. It really kind of depends on what's going on in the area.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I mean, a lot of border areas. I mean, when you think of border communities where people have moved very easily across borders, and so yeah, the fact that there's a border there doesn't really matter. They got family on the other side. Shopping's cheaper over there. Whatever. So yeah. I mean, these borders imposed by politicians don't mean, well, they don't mean a lot to people, but they are incredibly important. They do form barriers where sometimes no barriers used to exist. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought it was also really interesting when you talked about, because you didn't talk about it much today, when you talked about South Africa and kind of some of those arbitrary um, borders, with Soweto and places like that, and how some
Oh
of that
yeah.
has really shifted over time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It's yeah, borders within countries. I mean, South Africa would be a classic example where, I mean, there really were borders and restrictions on how people could move from one place to another, under what circumstances. So, yeah, that borders within country. Yeah, didn't have time for South Africa tonight. Sorry.
That's okay. Can you talk about the place you love to visit the most? What is it about that country or city that draws you back?
Oh boy. Well, hmm, it's a tough one. I mean, I love Indonesia, and I would love to return. I mean, I've got the little Indonesia have 17,000 islands, and I've been to three of them, so I've got a long way to go. And the people are lovely, and the food is great. I I have to put in, and it's just a very personal thing, a plug for Bangladesh. And let me just tell you a little story here. Okay. I've been to Bangladesh several times. April 2019, I was there with some colleagues working for UNICEF. We had a research conference and a curriculum symposium to do. And went out one hot day, and I wasn't feeling too good, and went back to the hotel. I thought I was dehydrated. I ended up in hospital the next morning and had to have a heart pacemaker put in. I almost died on the street in Dhaka Bangladesh. And unfortunately, I got to a good hospital with very competent doctors who, actually, when they prepped me for my operation, my pulse rate was down to 17. I was like, 2 more hours, we would not be having this conversation now. So, Bangladesh and Dhaka have a special place for me because that's where I almost died, and that's where I kind of came back to life again. So I mean that's always a special part of me. I mean it's not a great place to go as a tourist. It's a heavily polluted city and things like that, but a fascinating country, a fascinating history. I mean, I would like to travel more in Russia. I would love to do the Trans-Siberian Railway. I think I would. Probably after 3 or 4 days of it, I'd be get me off this train. But it's so yeah. I mean, I've lost interest, I think, in Western Europe. I used to travel in Western Europe when I lived in Britain. Now I'd be much more interested in going to West Africa or a few other sort of out of the way places. We'll see. Hope we can travel again soon.
Yes, yes. So I kind of took it from the stories you told that you kind of like what's off the beaten path, right? Not where's the popular place to go, but where you're going to kind of find the most interesting stories and interesting people.
Yeah, there's a great quote from the travel writer Thomas Swick. Well, not a great quote, but I mean, it means something to me. He says, travel is only interesting when things go wrong. So, if you've got a perfectly organized trip to somewhere and the flights are on time and you have no hassle and things like that, there's nothing to write about, So, I mean, I don't go looking for trouble, but, I prefer, I find much more interest in countries where things don't work very well, where things are not that efficient, where you have to work hard to figure out how you're going to get from here to here, or how you're going to get something done. And I mean, to some people, this is why a lot of people can't handle India. It's just sort of too much. It's too confusing. It's too, I mean, the poverty's in your face. I mean, the bureaucracy can be kind of stifling. But then at the same time, you've got thousands of years of history and religion and culture. And I mean, so I'm just, I'm just fascinated by places. So, I mean, but nobody hires me to go to the Netherlands anyway, So. They want me to go to Bangladesh and Madagascar and places like that. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one last question. So I'm going to ask: are you working on anything new?
Yeah, I actually am. It's a rather different project here. I'm actually got an interesting ghostwriting project with somebody. She lives in Minnesota now, but this is kind of it's a sort of historical memoir, but more than that. I mean, it covers what I'm going to say: wealth, power, privilege, the memory of slavery in wealthy philanthropic families from Boston, New York, and Savannah, Georgia, across 3 centuries. And she's got like 20 years of research there, and I'm trying to help her get a narrative out of this, which is totally fascinating, except there's too much stuff there. But it's a great writing project. So that, I hope, is going to keep me going until I can travel again. And I hope that's going to be soon.
Right. Yes. Well, I want to thank you for joining us this evening, and also our everyone who attended. And if you would like to buy a copy of the book, there are copies available at the Dock Bookshop, our local independent here in Fort Worth. And this is their contact information. She will do orders online, and you can have them shipped to you, picked up, or you can just go into the bookstore to purchase. And we have a lot of great author visits coming up. Please visit our website, fortworthlibrary.org, and check out our calendar for upcoming events. So thank you, and everyone have a great evening.
Thanks for everybody. Okay, good night. Stay safe.